on with me now. Go with me now. I'm gonna take you down. Go with me now. I'm gonna show you how. Go with me now.
All right, homeschoolers, we're back at it. We're going to learn. Now, this is our third lesson of Unit 5. It's about fiscal policy and the multipliers, which is the math that kind of goes around it. So to kind of quickly introduce this, I just want to point out something. You know, and this is something y'all already know. Okay, when you guys go and you spend money on ice cream, for example, GDP goes up. But what we didn't really discuss in Unit 3 about GDP is that when that spending becomes another person's income, then that person goes out and spends some of it, which makes GDP go up again. So we have this thing called the multiplier, which is really just a description of how when you spend $1, GDP goes up by more than $1 because of what the multiplier is. So that's kind of a quick intro to all of this. So let's see. By the end of this, I hope you all will be able to calculate the multipliers and then apply them to determine how much GDP might change when there's a certain change in spending. Okay? And of course, we'll be using the aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph that we learned about in Unit 4. Homework will be basically after you take the notes, I want you to do the 5-3 assignment in Blackboard, which will just reinforce all of these concepts. All right, so let's talk about fiscal policy. So first, I want to point something out. Y'all are aware that there's a virus going around, right? I personally feel a little bit like Rick Grimes, and I'm out here battling the world, trying to protect the family and all that stuff. But anyway, I'm not really. We're going to pretend that coronavirus has decreased aggregate demand because we're all staying at home. Nobody's traveling. You know, you're not going anywhere. The only thing you're buying is toilet paper and so on. So when that happens, the aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the left. All right. Now we're at point B on that graph, which y'all should recognize as a recessionary level of output. Okay, and of course the price level will also go down because when people are buying fewer things, there's less demand for it, and so prices naturally will fall. All right, so that's kind of what's going on here. Now, fiscal policy is designed to fix what just happened. Okay. So basically, it's the use of government spending or tax policy, either one, to help increase or decrease aggregate demand, whichever one we're trying to do. In this example, we're trying to increase aggregate demand, so two things that could happen is, one, we can increase government spending, okay, or taxes could be lowered, which would then increase consumption spending. So either way, what ends up happening, theoretically, is if the government spends more money or they lower our taxes and we spend more money, the aggregate demand curve will shift back, and therefore the economy will be fixed. So that's what fiscal policy is. All right. There are two types of it, though, and so you need to know these two types. First, we have expansionary policy. All this is doing is exactly what the name implies. It is fiscal policy designed to expand the economy, to expand GDP, to expand aggregate demand. All right? The example that we just gave, where I was increasing consumption spending through lower taxes or increasing government spending just by the government increasing spending, both of those are expansionary. All right? So, really, this is all you got to know. Expansionary policy is when the government increases spending or when the government lowers taxes, either one. Now, there's also contractionary policy. Okay? Contractionary policy is where the government now is trying to slow down the economy because it's maybe running a little too strong, it's too hot. Okay, people are buying too many things, you're starting to see bad inflation, and so the goal here is to slow it down by reducing aggregate demand. So contractionary policy is implemented by either decreasing government spending or increasing taxes, and those two combinations will decrease aggregate demand. All right. So let's implement some expansionary fiscal policy and go through kind of like the cause and effect chain is basically how I describe this. So I'm going to draw my aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph first. Okay. Let's see here. I've got my long run aggregate supply curve. I've got my short run aggregate supply curve. And then if we're going to demonstrate expansionary fiscal policy, it must mean we're in a recession. So I'm going to draw aggregate demand a little lower. These little glitch guys, they are annoying. So I draw it a little bit lower than it should be. Okay, so at that current equilibrium, you can see it's point A. Man, that's annoying. These little glitches, I don't know if they bug y'all, but they really bug me. So I'm stopping. There we go. All right, so at point A, we're in a recession. So what we just discussed is we will increase government spending or we will lower taxes, okay, either one of those in order to increase aggregate demand. Now, when we lower taxes, consumption spending will increase, and so aggregate demand will increase. Okay, so let me remind you. So aggregate demand, let's not forget, it is equal to consumer spending plus investment spending plus government purchases plus our net exports. So if the government increases their spending, or if they lower taxes and we increase our consumption spending, the aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. Okay, I'm going to get rid of all that because we don't really need it there. Okay, so now the economy is at point B. Okay, so real GDP has increased. The price level has also gone up. Okay, so you can see along the x-axis, GDP has increased. Along the y-axis, price level has increased. When there's more GDP, there's more employment. So employment has gone up. And then that means the unemployment rate will go down. And that's really the goal of expansionary policy, is to keep the economy rolling and then keep more people employed. Okay? So that's basically what we're looking at here. Now let's look at contractionary policy. Okay, we'll do the same thing. Except if we're going to be using contractionary policy, that means the economy is a little stronger than it is supposed to be. Okay. Now most people would look at that and say, well, what's wrong with it being a little stronger? I mean, isn't that a good thing? Well, it can be, but the problem here is that short run equilibrium is at such a high price level that inflation is kind of the problem. So we don't want the inflation. We want to drag aggregate demand down so that we're just at our regular old full employment equilibrium. And that's when the economy is healthy. So how are we going to do this? We're going to decrease government spending, or we're going to raise taxes. Either one. If you raise taxes, consumption spending will go down because we won't have as much money to spend. Aggregate demand will shrink. Okay, so it shifts to the left. All right. When aggregate demand shifts to the left, we get a new equilibrium. We'll call it point B. That has less GDP, a lower price level, which is what we were trying to accomplish because that's what contractionary fiscal policy is for. It is designed to reduce inflation. Now, side effect, to lower the price level, we had to give up a little bit of employment. But probably at that point A, we had unemployment that was too low anyway, so that's okay. And then so we have brought the unemployment rate up. That is contractionary fiscal policy. All right? So let's see if y'all can recognize.
Now here's pain.
All right. Let's see if you can recognize when something is expansionary or if it's contractionary. So you should have these in your notes, and so we'll just go through them one at a time. But if you want to pause and answer the questions now, just to make sure you understand it, and then I'll go through and explain why each answer is what it is. All right, let's do the first one. So the President and Congress extend unemployment benefits for up to 96 weeks for those that can't find work. So the key here is the unemployment benefits. That is money coming from the government to people that are unemployed so that those people will spend it. And so that is going to be expansionary. All right? Now, what about this one? The President and Congress raise personal income taxes on the top 10% of wage earners. So the top 10% to pay their fair share, blah, blah, blah. That's going to take money out of the economy. So those people aren't going to buy things. They're not going to start new businesses. And so we would say that's contractionary. Okay? So aggregate demand would fall. All right, what about government increases war spending to combat ISIS? All right, well, if they do that, they're going to spend more money, right? Well, that makes it expansionary. And then lastly, the example here is the government raises the gasoline tax. Again, taxes going up is going to be contractionary. So, you know what? Just in case you didn't get all that from before, if something is expansionary, it's because the government is increasing spending or they are decreasing taxes. If it is contractionary, it's because the government is decreasing spending or the government is raising taxes. Okay? All right, let's roll on to the next thing. Let's talk about how fiscal policy, maybe expansionary fiscal policy, for example, could affect interest rates. Okay? So let's say the government increases their spending by $787 billion to counteract a recession. The thing is that the government doesn't have that money laying around. So they go to the loanable funds market and they borrow it. Okay? And so when the government increases borrowing, the demand curve shifts to the right and interest rates rise. Okay? Now, the reason that's a big deal is because you guys learned that when interest rates go up, that's going to cause all interest rate sensitive spending, like investment or consumption for when I like to go buy a new car, for example. That type of spending is going to decrease because at higher interest rates, it's more expensive to borrow money. Okay? So that's kind of a foreshadowing of something we're going to see in our next lesson. All right. So let's talk about automatic stabilizers now. So a lot of times, you will actually, it's every single time. Every time there is a recession, the government's deficits get bigger. Now, remember what we mean by deficit is if the government spends more money than it has, it goes and borrows the difference. Well, the borrowing is the deficit, basically. And so whenever there's a recession, even if fiscal policy is not implemented, there will be deficits because we have something called automatic stabilizers, or it's basically fiscal policy that's non-discretionary. It happens by itself. Okay? So for example, if I lose my job and have no income, I'm going to receive a welfare check, some food stamps, and an unemployment check. Okay, that happens automatically. The Congress doesn't have to pass a law that says Walden gets his payments. It just happens by itself. So if there was a recession, that type of spending is automatically going to increase. Okay, and that's going to be expansionary. Okay, so during a recession, transfer payments increase. That happens to be expansionary because then we go out and we spend money and the aggregate demand increases. Now, the progressive income tax. If I don't have a job, am I paying taxes? Probably not. So taxes automatically decrease during a recession. Okay, and that's also expansionary. So these automatic stabilizers automatically put in place what we call counter-cyclical stabilizers. Okay, meaning if we're in a recession, these two things help to bring you out of a recession. All right, so during a recession, let's say the transfer payments increase, that's going to also increase aggregate demand. Okay, progressive income tax, those automatically decrease. That also will increase aggregate demand because less tax money is coming out of the economy, and so people have more to spend. And the impact on the budget is this: they both will create more deficits. Okay, and you can also reason that the exact opposite is true. When the economy is really, really strong, people need fewer transfer payments, and their taxes are automatically higher as a result. And so the exact opposite happens whenever there's inflation. So let's go through that using a graph. Now, this isn't that important as far as what I'm about to be doing, but it helps to illustrate why it is that taxes automatically go down in a recession, spending automatically goes up, and then the opposite's true for inflation. So let's pretend we're sitting here at a full employment, long-run equilibrium economy. Everything's going great. Okay? there are some assumptions here. It says that the government normally has a balanced budget, so they tax, and then that's exactly how much they spend. So they never have to borrow money in this example, okay? They normally have a balanced budget. So all taxes are used for welfare. So there's no defense spending, no roads, any of that. All right, and the tax rate is 10% of income. So let me remind you of something. GDP is income. So if our GDP were $1,000 and taxes are 10% of income, then the tax revenue is going to be $100 when the economy is booming or strong, normal, okay? And then all of those $100 get spent, okay? So that shows our balanced budget when the economy is normal, okay? Now, what if we go into a recession? So aggregate demand falls. Whoops, I want that in red so you can better see it. Okay. Aggregate demand falls. Now we have a new level of GDP. Let's say it's 900. Okay. So now taxes are only 90 because it's still 10% of income. However, now you have more people unemployed and more of them are going to require assistance of some sort. So remember, this economy has a balanced budget under normal circumstances. In a recession, its government spending automatically increases. Let's say it goes to 110, okay? And so now, because of the higher unemployment and the lower tax revenue, there is a $20 deficit in this case, okay? Now, let's see, there's inflation. Okay, aggregate demand increases. By the way, I should have put a 2 there. All right, and now at this equilibrium, maybe 1,200 is the GDP. So now taxes are going to be 120 because it's always 10% of the income. But now, with the economy that strong, there's no way that there's as many unemployed people or people on welfare. So the government spending is going to be much lower. Maybe it's maybe it just goes back to 100. Who knows? Anyway, now you have a $20 surplus. Okay, so the idea of transfer payments and the progressive income tax, those are automatic stabilizers that help to smooth out the business cycle. Okay. All right, let's roll on. So we're going to talk about the multiplier now. If you haven't done it yet, this is the part in the lecture where you really need to pay attention. Okay. So let me give you an example of how this works. All right, let's pretend that on average, people spend about 75% of their income and they save 25%. All right? And the government comes along and they need to spend $200 billion on new highways. So the government's going to spend $200 billion. That $200 billion becomes income to the highway workers who are going to set aside 25% of it but then spend 75%. So government spending $200 billion on highways increased GDP by $200 billion. But then the highway workers, they bought $150 billion worth of boats. Okay, so GDP went up again by $150 billion. Now the boat workers, they have just seen their incomes rise by $150 billion. They're going to set aside 25% of that to savings, but then they're going to spend the other 75% of it and buy those new iPod phones. I think the iPod 11 has come out. Okay, so that's another $112.5 billion. So basically, all of this spending in the economy will continue on until there's nothing left to multiply. Okay, so what you're about to learn is that by being given this information right up here, just what I circled at the top, by just giving you that piece of information, you'll be able to tell me that GDP would actually grow to an amount of 800 billion. Okay? So that's why you got to pay attention so that you'll understand how to do that. Okay? All right. So let's talk about a couple of things. First, we're going to talk about average propensity to consume. Okay, so with my English word definition, what that is it's the percentage of income that is consumed. It's basically, hey, what percent of our income do we spend? All right. Then we have average propensity to save, which is the percentage of our income that we save. Okay, those are the English definitions. Mathematically, they look like this. Now, over here, don't get confused. C, remember that stands for consumption. And the letter Y stands for income. So mathematically, APC is basically consumption divided by income. For example, if I make $50,000 a year and I spend $48,000, I have an APC of 0.96. All right, so that's how we calculate it. It's actually pretty straightforward. I also want to point out that it is possible to spend more money than you earn. So it is possible that that could happen. In that case, your APC would be bigger than 1, and your APS would have to be negative. Now, I didn't emphasize this, so let me do that real quick. If you know one of those numbers, you automatically know the second one because added together they will always equal 1. Okay? 1 representing 100%. All right? Now we leave it as a ratio though. We don't call it a percent. It's not necessarily 96%. It's just 0.96. All right? So that's APC and APS. Now, I told you about those, but they're not really that important. This is more important. Okay? We have MPC and MPS. Those are super important. All right? These are what's going to help us figure out what the multiplier is. So MPC stands for marginal propensity to consume, which is basically the percentage change in income that is consumed. All right? MPS is marginal propensity to save, which is the percentage change in income that is saved. So let me use more plain language. Basically what this means is what percentage of new income are you spending and what percentage of new income are you saving? All right? So mathematically, here's the equations. All right? It is change in consumption divided by change in income. That's our MPC. And our MPS is change in savings divided by our change in income. So I got two examples. All right, if I get a $1,000 raise and I spend $750 of it, my MPC is 0.75. So basically I'm spending 75% of my new income. That's what MPC is. That has nothing to do with my total income. All right? And by the way, we're not that interested in what we do with our total income. It's what we do with our new income that will help shape fiscal policy. All right? Same example, if I get the $1,000 income change, but I save $250 of it, then my MPS is 0.25. So I just took the change in savings divided by the change in income. So that's MPC and MPS. Now, on the next slide, we're going to look at the multiplier. All right? Now, I want you to read what is written there so that it makes sense. Okay? So, I put my two examples from the last slide up here, and I want to make sure that I highlight exactly what's going on here. So the multiplier, it's called that because it tells us how much GDP will increase when our spending increases. For example, if I spend $100, then GDP will increase by more than 100. However, it depends on the multiplier as to how much. So if the multiplier is 4, and I spend $100, GDP could increase by $400. That's basically what we're talking about. Now, this says there's 3 types of multipliers. We're going to ignore the third one because, honestly, you will figure that one out on your own. So we're not going to waste time on it. Instead, we're just going to look at the spending multiplier and the tax multiplier. By the way, the spending multiplier is also called an expenditure multiplier. So I've written it both ways. All right? So, don't forget these 2 equations at the top, okay? Because you kind of need those. So let's use our examples. The expenditure multiplier, we'll do that first. I've used notation as MS for spending or ME for expenditure, the M being multiplier. So the expenditure multiplier is 1 over MPS. That is how you calculate it. In our example at the top, MPS is 0.25. So 1 over 0.25 is 4. So our multiplier would be 4. All right? Now, all the econ textbooks always try to complicate this, so they give you the equation as 1 divided by 1 minus MPC. Well, let's do it that way. You get the same number, by the way, so it's all good. 1 divided by 1 minus 0.75, that is also 4, okay? Because we're doing that. Okay? That's the expenditure multiplier. Now, the tax multiplier, this one tells us how much GDP could change if Congress changes our taxes. Okay? Tax multiplier is always one multiple less than the expenditure multiplier. So with our example, as we continue forward, our expenditure multiplier was 4. If we subtract 1 from it, what do we get? That's right, 3. Or the econ textbooks, they always just say take your MPC and divide by your MPS. So we can do that also. 0.75 divided by 0.25, what does that give us? 3. Okay? So these multipliers tell us how much GDP will change by. So now we're going to put them into action, okay? Oh, almost forgot. The Walden Rule, very important. All right? So when we start applying the multipliers, you're going to be asked things like how much should government spending change by to close a recessionary gap? Or if your gap is so much, how much should taxes change by? Or if you raise spending by $1, how much does GDP change by, and so on. So basically, as long as you know 2 of these variables that I have in these equations, you will be able to calculate the third one. So let's keep our example going from before. Let's pretend that our multiplier was 4. Okay, that's the expenditure multiplier. And let's say we have a $1,000 recessionary gap. So GDP is 1,000 less than it should be. Okay? That means that if we increase government spending by 250, that multiplies 4 times to become $1,000. And so that's how you're going to use what I call the Walden Rule. Okay? Let's say we want to do taxes instead. Tax multiplier was 3 from our last example. If our recessionary gap is 1,000, that means we need to change taxes by $333.33. Okay? That's what that means. Now, do you increase or do you decrease taxes? That's the thing. You have to decrease. So this kind of is only used with absolute value. So if you know that you want GDP to rise, then you lower taxes. If you want GDP to get smaller, then you increase taxes. So you just got to keep those straight. All right? So we're going to fill out a little chart here to help us understand all of this. I'm going to do the first row, and then you guys are going to pause, and you're going to fill out the rest of them so that we can make sure we know what we're doing, okay? All right, so here's the parameters. Basically, everybody gets a $1,000 raise, and with that $1,000 raise, which is our change in income, okay? So really, that is our change in income. Then we're going to go and we're going to spend 900. So hang on here. This was our change in income, the 1,000. This 900 down here is our change in consumption. So MPC, which is basically change in consumption divided by change in income, is going to be 0.9 because we took 900 and we divided by 1,000. Okay? So how did we get it? 900 divided by 1,000. Okay? And that's how we got it. Now, if we already had the MPS, then we could have gotten this by just subtracting the MPS. Okay? So either way. Let's do the MPS now. So it stands to reason that if you spend 900, then you have 100 left that you can save. So one way to calculate that is to change in savings divided by change in income. Or, since we already have our MPC, we can just subtract 0.9 from 1. Either way, what do we get? 0.1. Okay? So that is our MPS. Now, the expenditure multiplier, remember that? That's just 1 over MPS, or it's 1 over 1 minus MPC, okay, if you want to do extra work. Anyway, 1 divided by 0.1 is 10, so the multiplier would be 10. And then the tax multiplier, which is ME minus 1, okay, or MPC over MPS, okay, depending on what information you're given, that would be 9. And so now these last 2 columns, listen to this explanation, okay? We want to know how much does GDP change by if there's a $20 increase in government spending. Well, remember, the government spending is 20, the multiplier is 10, so all we're doing is we're going to take 20 multiplied by 10, and so we would get the answer as $200, okay, because 20 times 10 is 200. So government spends $20 with a multiplier of 10, GDP increases by 200. Now, the last column is dealing with the tax cut now. So instead of spending $20, the government gives me $20. They give it back to me. Okay? So this one is going to be the tax multiplier times the $20. So 9 times 20 means GDP will go up by 180. Now I know it goes up because it's a tax cut. If it were a tax increase, then GDP would go down by 180. Okay? All right, so you do the rest of them, and when you're finished, we'll go through and I'll just fill in the answers for you real quick. All right? So that's kind of how you will apply this. Now that's just practice doing the math. We're going to actually apply it using economics. All right? So let's pretend that we're in a recession. All right? In order to demonstrate that we're in a recession, whoops, I should probably draw my graph to indicate that. So short-run aggregate supply, here's aggregate demand. I got my current equilibrium, which is 60 billion short of my full employment level of GDP, so we'll say it's 800. That means the distance between full employment and the current level is 60. Okay, that's important. That's the gap. Okay, we have a $60 gap that we want to close. Okay, so here's some data that we have collected. We have seen that with a change in income of 1,000, consumption changes by 900. Okay, that means savings must be changing by 100. That means MPC must be, let's see, 900 over 1,000. That gives us 0.9. Whoops, another glitch. Okay, 0.9. And if MPC is 0.9, MPS must be 0.1 because those two have to add up to 1. All right. And our expenditure multiplier should be 1 over 0.1, which is 10. And that means our tax multiplier, which is 10 minus 1, because it's ME minus 1, will be 9. So my little Walden Rule tells me this. Let me change colors so this is more easily seen. Now, I got my change in GDP will be equal to my change in government spending times my expenditure multiplier. We just calculated that the expenditure multiplier is 10, and our GDP, we want GDP to change by 60 because we want to close the gap. Okay, so we want to see GDP change by 60, and so all we got to do is increase government spending by 6. Okay, so if we increase government spending by 6, that will shift the AD curve to the right, and we have fixed the recession. Yay us. All right, real quick, let's do it for taxes instead. So change in real GDP, again, is equal to our change in taxes times our tax multiplier. So our tax multiplier is 9. And again, we want GDP to change by 60. So this must be 6.67. And then don't forget, if you want GDP to go up, you need to decrease taxes by that much. All right? So that's kind of how we're applying this. Now, why don't you do it on this next example? And I think this is our last one for the lecture, but then we're going to go over a practice quiz. All right? So we have go ahead. I'll give you all a few minutes. All right, so here's what you should have done. All right, you should have shown the economy at an inflationary level of output. So all that means is our equilibrium is to the right of the long-run aggregate supply curve. So we're at 1,200. Okay. We've been given all this data over here. So our change in savings will be 20 because the 80 and the 20 have to add up to the 100 there. All right, our MPC is going to be 80 over 100, which is 0.8, which means our MPS is 0.2, which means our ME is 5, and our tax multiplier is 4. So if we want to fix this economy, we're going to apply our little Walden Rule again. So real GDP is going to be equal to, or change in real GDP rather, is going to be equal to our change in government spending times our expenditure multiplier, or our change in taxes times our tax multiplier. Okay? So, let's fill in the numbers. Expenditure multiplier is 5. Tax multiplier is 4. In both cases, we want to shrink GDP by 200 because that's our gap this time. Okay? Right here, 200 is our gap. So 5 times what equals 200? I got 40. So we would decrease, okay, decrease government spending by 40, or you could raise taxes by 50. Okay? Again, we want aggregate demand to shrink, so less government spending would cause it to shift left, or raising taxes will take money out of consumers' hands, so consumption spending would decrease, and that would also shift aggregate demand back to the left to fill or to close that gap and bring the economy back to its full employment level. All right.
Come with me now. Come with me now.